Okay, Beth.
Okay, well, thank you, Joel. This is a history, a little bit of churches in the whole town of Cambridge, but there's more history on the Cambridge Church, which is now Cambridge Christian Fellowship. So just some early history here to kind of bore you before we get started, but 1775 to 1783 was the American Revolution. And during that time, the Declaration of Independence was signed. And also during the end of that time, the town of Cambridge was chartered. It was chartered by Governor Thomas Chittenden. And the deal was, in order to hold land, each man was required to plant and cultivate at least 5 acres of land, build a house at least 18 square feet on the floor, or have a family settled on each respective right within 3 years. So 2 years later, in 1783, John Spafford came to here as the first settler. Spafford was a soldier who had lost a leg in the Revolutionary War. When he first came, he cleared 2 acres, planted corn, built a log house, and then went back to New Hampshire for his wife and 2 children. And then in 1784, others followed to settle in Cambridge, one of those being John Safford and his wife, Elizabeth Montague. They came to Cambridge. So in 1784, there were 35 people who had settled here by the time of the second winter. In 1785, the town was organized. The first deed was recorded in Cambridge. They had their first town meeting and they elected officers. And then 1786, the first school building was built. It was a log school in Pumpkin Harbor. There were 5 families in that first school, and John Safford was the first teacher. Remember, education and religion were very closely tied back then, and both were important to the early settlers. And that around that same time, there were plans to start a church, and they even called as their minister a man named Mr. Jacob Wood. So life rolled along, and then 1791, Vermont became the 14th. Motorcycles going by Gina's house. Vermont became the 14th state to join the Union, as we all know. And at this time, the census of Cambridge was 359 people. I'll compare that to something. Johnson had 93 people at that time, and Morrisville had 10. So in 1792, the Congregational Society of Cambridge was organized under a man named Ithamar Hibbard of Bennington. There were 12 members. Those early meetings were held in barns and homes, and Hibbard preached intermittently during those early years. There was a revival of religion that reached nearly every household in town. So there's the first revival, 1792. So this picture is quite a few years later, but I wanted to show you this picture because the first Congregational church was raised in 1805. And that church would be right here, which was in the center of town. In this church, there was no heat. The pastor preached from the carpenter's bench. The congregation sat on slab seats and they kept warm with foot stoves. Birds came in freely as no windows were covered. This was the first church building in all of northern Vermont. And the first pastor in this building was Reverend Elijah Woolidge, who was dismissed or let go after 1 year. This church building stood and was used unfinished for 20 years. So around this time, actually in 1800, the population of Cambridge was 733, so twice what it was a few years before. And then in 1808, there was another revival. And then in 1816, I think you're all aware of 1816 and froze to death. There was snow or ice in every month of the year. The following year, 1817, there was another revival. And then things started growing here. The first covered bridge was built shortly after that in 1825. That was the bridge between Jeffersonville and Cambridge Junction. And then life is moving right along and things are happening here. 1826, the inn in Cambridge was built called the Eagle Hotel. Also in 1826, there was another revival. This one was called the Great Reformation. This lasted about a year. It included people from all denominations. Evening meetings would begin at early candle lighting. That's in quotes. In 1827, a religious society, apparently interdenominational, built the brick church in Cambridge Center, now Jeffersonville. The old brick church was later an opera house, then a theater, and a town meeting place. High school graduations were held here for many years. And I remember when there were plays here for many years. In fact, George, I think you were in at least one play here. This is now the Jeffersonville Post Office and the Cambridge Town Clerk's Office, as I'm sure you all recognized it. And in 1831, Cambridge Borough and Cambridge Center kept getting their mail mixed up. There was a request to Congress to change Cambridge Center to Jeffersonville, and this request was granted. In 1843, the South Cambridge Church was built. This was used for some unknown years as a church and eventually fell into disrepair. Later in the 1920s, it was rescued and used as a community hall, later still a ski dorm, and now Martell's restaurant. Quite a change there, huh? And then in 1849, the Methodist Church in Cambridge was built and dedicated. The Methodists had been meeting in barns. And also the old meeting house, the Congregational church building, which was across the street, was redecorated and rededicated. This Methodist church was between where Sam Lotto lives and the Yellow House, a couple doors down. For a while, it was Doug Tobin's little shop. Some of you would remember that. The doctors had an office in there for a few years. I believe it's now apartments. So this Great Reformation that I've referenced, it would appear that this Great Reformation, also called the Second Great Awakening in some books, it was kind of the revival of 1826 and 27, but it was more widespread than just this one year. It seems to me in my research that it kind of spanned the whole first half of the 19th century. It has been said that 30 to 60 different sects of religion were known in this area during this time. That is undocumented, but I did find that somewhere. One that is documented was called the Perfectionists, led by John Humphrey Noyes. His group started in Putney in the 1830s, with a small newsletter going out around Vermont. There was some interest in this area, in the Cambridge and Fletcher area specifically. So these folks were all Christians. They were just seeking a new depth of Christian living. One family from Cambridge who followed Noyes was the Kinsley Barron family. They sold their farm in 1852 to Joel Putnam, my great-great-grandfather, and followed John Humphrey Noyes to Oneida, New York. So this is a picture of the Oneida Community House, taken many years ago. You can tell by the dress of the people. As in the book of Acts, Noyes' group lived communally, relinquishing all claims and rights of ownership, sharing all living responsibilities, including all the workload that went on with a large group of people, raising all the children together. They also mated with permission of party leaders, trying to produce the best of the best. Remnants of this community, no longer a commune, are still in Oneida. The business, which started as a metal trap business for trapping animals, is now Oneida Silverware Company. So this 50 or so year period in the first half of the 19th century saw great growth. In 1800, the population was 733. By 1850, it was 1849. There were churches, schools, businesses, bridges, and homes built. Cambridge was the largest town in Lamoille County and was a wealthy and respected town. This slide shows Cambridge Borough flooded in 1869. It also shows the Congregational Church and the Methodist Church original buildings. Right here across the way, this is the Methodist Church. So then after that period of growth in the first half of the century, then comes the 1861 Civil War. And then following the Civil War in 1875, there was another revival. In 1876, the railroad opened. The Burlington and Lamoille Railroad was completed. In my grandmother's diary, it was written, it was a gala day. In 1885, the Methodist Church, the parishioners signed a petition to take out the box pews, replace them with new ones, quote, which shall be more comfortable and convenient, and consent to have all seating free to all who attend. So this is a picture of the new pews that were put in 1885. This is the Methodist Church. And then in a few years later, across the road, the Congregational Church building was moved to a new location. The new location was beside where the current health center now stands. Work began immediately on a new church building on the current site. And here is your new church building. They moved it in the summer, and 5 months later, in January of 1888, the church was dedicated. They had taken the bell out of the old church and moved it to the new church. They put a time capsule with a little history in the ball of the spire. And now pews, free to all, circular in form and of solid oak. So this picture shows the pews in their original places and their original shape and the oak, even though this is a more modern picture. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So this new building was heated and it was furnished beautifully, and it was almost free of debt. Quite a change from the original unfinished, bird-filled, unheated building that had been finally completed before it was moved. But the quote from a diary about this new building was, "It seems marvelous." So this is the new building. They had a new stained glass window put in. I'm not going to talk a lot about the window. I think the names and the dates on the window are kind of self-explanatory. And the church sanctuary itself looked like this, although the pews were kind of a dark stain. And they put a few years later, in 1895, they put a clock in the belfry, and it was started on September 12, 1895. This was made by E. Howard Company in Boston. The works of this industrial grade clock are 4 feet high. There's a winch used to raise the timing weight, gravity powered like a grandfather clock. It takes 25 crank turns to raise the timing weight and 195 crank turns to raise the chime weight. The weights are actually boxes of rocks. Reg Wilcox cranks this every week and keeps this town clock running. Thanks, Reg. So shortly before this, in 1889, the second Congregational Church was built in Jeffersonville. This is a picture of Cambridge Village somewhere around 1895. There were 4 churches, 2 here in the village, And then there was the one in Jeffersonville and the one in South Cambridge. The H.N. Gray House was built in 1893. And there was a quote that there was not a known empty tenement and not a known unemployed person. So it looked to me like life was rather glorious and smooth. And then in 1899, on December 8th, 1899, on a windy evening, fire destroyed the old meeting house down here, which is the original Congregational building that had been moved. It was now called a meeting house. And it burned the school and 2 homes, one with a granary and a barn and a woodshed. I feel it's important to mention Reverend Edwin Wheelock somewhere in here. He and his wife Laura were both very respected and beloved. Reverend Wheelock ministered from 1855 to 1901. He had a very dignified bearing, visited farmhouses and invited people to church, often walking 3 or 4 miles on these trips. Reverend Wheelock married over 800 couples in his career, and he did over 1,200 funerals in his life here. He retired in 1901 and died in 1907. Reverend Wheelock built and lived in the house at the east end of Cambridge Village, where Gina Little now lives, where I'm sitting right now. And his daughter, Lucy Wheelock, went to Boston and started what later became Wheelock College. So this is the Borough School. We're now in the 20th century. Fire has taken the old school, which was kind of on this lot, and they called it the Meeting House, which was the original Congregational church. So now a new school is built. This is built on the site of where the health center currently is. And the health center was torn down. This building, was torn down in 1967, and the health center was built shortly thereafter. And also in 1901, the old brick church in Jeffersonville was purchased by the town. And then we have another church, the North Cambridge Church. This was built in 1903, called the Francis Wilson Memorial Church and Library, built in North Cambridge. It burned in 1969. However, it had not been used for Sunday services since around 1950. Again, this church burned in 1969 on a Sunday morning. It had apparently been used for a wedding the day before, but had not been used for regular services for almost 20 years. And then St. Mary's Mission was built. This says 1910, so I don't know if it was built in 1910 or if this picture was in 1910. And then in 1927, I think you all recognize this. This is the flood. But an interesting little fact that we hadn't talked about before was in 1916, the Methodist Church in Cambridge and the Congregational Church in Cambridge, which were across the road from each other, combined forces, and they started having their Sunday services together. The services were held in the Congregational Church building, and the Methodist Church building was used mostly for youth groups and parties and various other non-service functions. So in the 1927 flood, that Methodist church had not been used for Sunday services, but during the flood, a cow found its way to the steps of the Methodist church, and that cow stayed on those steps until the waters receded. In the Congregational church across the road, the water was up to 6 inches deep in the pews, and the health officer closed the church to services. So the congregants went across the street to the Methodist church and held their services there for about a year. So this slide shows, I'm not going to read this to you, don't worry. This shows a list of ministers that were here in the Congregational Church in Cambridge through all the years. And it starts up here with Mr. Ithamar Hibbard, and then it goes down through. But if you'll notice down through here, many of these people were dismissed. So there don't seem to be any details about these, but it looks to me like they would get a guy in, didn't like him, and just let him go, and he's gone. And then a couple more things I would like to point out here. Right here is the 1916, I mentioned, the Methodist Church combined with the Cambridge Church. Now it's called the Cambridge Federated Church. And down here, Walter Gould was the pastor from 1917 to 1921. Walter Gould was my grandfather. My mother was very young, almost 5 years old when they left here, and they went to Westburg. I found a diary of his church work here, detailing by name, date, etc., all baptisms, all marriages, all funerals, all sermon titles, all mission work, and some financial accounts as well. It appeared that my grandfather earned $1,400 a year. The Sunday school had 25 students, and my other grandfather, Kinsley Putnam, was the Sunday school superintendent. So I'd also like to point out a few other things here. So there were these few ministers here that were preaching in the Congregational Church, but ME stands for Methodist. They were Methodist pastors. And then in 1931, when Ed French was minister, the Methodist Church burned. But remember, it hadn't been used for Sunday services. It was only used for parties and various other functions, youth group meetings, stuff like that. So that burned in 1931. And then in 1936, I'm guessing because of finances, they couldn't afford to hire someone full-time, that the Cambridge Congregational Church, which is now the only church in Cambridge Village, became yoked with the Jeffersonville Congregational Church. So they shared a pastor during all these years. They often had services together, although Sunday mornings were separate in each church. So the pastor here would preach in one church and then the other on every Sunday morning. So all through from 1936 to 1968, these churches, Jeffersonville and Cambridge Congregational churches, were yoked. And in 1968, I believe there were some differences of opinion, and the churches split again. Cambridge had joined the United Church of Christ and now became Cambridge United Church. And then after they split with Jeffersonville, Cambridge had 3 pastors here, and until it became Cambridge Christian Fellowship. I think this is the bell that came out of the Methodist Church. There was a bell in the Methodist Church that had been removed from the church before the fire because the structure that it was in wasn't able to hold it. So it was housed for a while in a small little garage behind Marco Hooper's mobile station. And at first it was used to call people to fires, and then I think it was just housed there. And I'm wondering if it was housed in the basement of the Cambridge Congregational Church for a bit, because that's what this looks like. It looks like it's being loaded onto a truck, and I believe this is my dad right here, Harold Putnam, and I believe this is Chuck Martin. I don't know the year this picture was taken. Anyway, this Methodist bell was moved down to South Burlington on Dorset Street to the Methodist Church down there, where it still resides. And then just as a side note here, in 1932, the census of Cambridge was 1,400 people, 1,402 to be exact. And in 1940, there was electricity that came to the Putnam farm. It was a very exciting time. My grandfather, Kinsley Putnam, wrote in his diary, "Electric current turned on for first time, so the men used it while doing chores, a great help." And by January 19th, 6 days later, electricity was for the first time in the kitchen, over the table, over the sink, and in a pantry, which is a small separate room. And the quote from the diary was quite thrilling. There was lots of change here toward the end of the 1800s and the first half of the next century. 1893, the H.N. Gray House was built, and he had electricity furnished by a generator. Then electricity came into the village here in those first 20, 30 years, and then to the outlying farms in the late 30s and early 40s. With electricity came refrigeration, which was big for the farmers. Automobiles came in, so transportation changed. The Red 46 burned in 1931, as did the Methodist Church. And in 1952, the double bridge was moved to Shelburne Museum. Through this time, some of the town's post offices were closed or consolidated. Some of the many churches built around town were no longer in use. Some of the schools around the town closed or consolidated, as the new school in Jeffersonville was built in 1914 for grades 1 through 10, and then in 1920 for grades 1 through 12. In 1938, the railroad stopped coming to Cambridge, and the new Route 104 was built in 1954, I believe. I can remember that barely. Here we have a slide that was labeled Cambridge Community Church. So apparently the name changed from Cambridge Federated Church to Cambridge Community Church. And then in 1961, it became Cambridge United Church. This particular picture was on an offering envelope. And there's a little girl at the door here. I don't know if you can see her. That little girl is me. So I'm placing this slide somewhere around 1950. In 1958, the Congregational Church in Cambridge decided to build classrooms downstairs. So they dug out the backside on the underside of the church, put classrooms in, put a furnace in, and this picture is of a man at a wood bee cutting wood for this furnace. Bill Cook was the chair of this project. The church had borrowed $3,500 from the Cemetery Association at 4% interest. At one time, there were more than 40 children attending the Sunday school. This slide is of Children's Day. Every year, with such a large children's population, every year at the end of the school year and the end of the Sunday school year, there was a Children's Day that would celebrate children. We were honored as children, and each child was given a potted petunia that you can see here. Children of all ages participated in the service, from the high school kids right down to the little kids doing some kind of a little dance or song. I don't know about dance, but a song or some little thing. And this family is my family of origin. So this is my dad and my mother, and this is me and John and Bill. And sorry, George, you got left out of this one. So this is the same picture that we had again. In the 1980s, the church went through, I kind of called it a mini revival again. The church was packed full every Sunday. Many kids were in the Sunday school. And then the church decided to do a big renovation project. They blew insulation in for heat retention. The front foundation was repaired. This big window was re-leaded, and then it was protected by plexiglass. The ramp that is no longer there, but that was built in 1984. In 87 and 88, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the church building. And about that time, we started renovating these pews. These pews were stained a dark brown with a dark brown leathery type seat. And now they have all been stripped down to their original oak. Really is beautiful wood. And the cushions are a fabric, a softer fabric. There was a new carpet put in. There were cracks in the lath and plaster on the wall. Those were repaired and painted. New antique chandeliers were hung in the sanctuary. And work was started on the addition of the back fellowship hall. A septic tank was added. The project was completed in 1999. This is Craig Benson, by the way, in the pulpit. So these are some parishioners where these last slides are all in my lifetime and in my memory. These are some parishioners. Here is my mother and father, Harold and Lois Putnam. This is Clifford Porter and half of Mary Porter's face. I think this picture was taken at our wedding, and I also noticed that it's flipped backwards. This is Roy Hutchins and Amy Hutchins. And this is Jim Perry, the minister who married Jerry and I. So I think that this was 1970. This, I believe, is Andy Butler's profile. And I think this is my brother, Bill Putnam, talking with Andy. And also, I think this is John Butler. Don't recognize anyone else in that picture. I would add that there was, through the 50s and 60s, there was a active ladies' union, which later became a women's fellowship. The women often would raise money for various things, sometimes specific things. Sometimes they'd give a chunk of money for operating expenses, but mostly for repairs and extras. This is an ordination. This was in the early 60s. This is Bob Boutwell and his wife Florence, and this is Ada Foss. And I think this is someone I should know, but I don't. And I believe these two people were from out of town, some bigwigs here for the ordination. Mr. Boutwell was the last person that was here when Cambridge and Jeff were joint churches together. And these next ones are lawn parties. Lawn parties and Sugar on Snow were held on Thursday in the end of July, starting in the 50s, going through the 60s, 70s. The last one was in 1980. And I'm going to name a few people because I think some of you will remember these. I believe this is Edna Sweeney. This is Bernice Weston, and I think this is Marilyn Weston, her daughter-in-law. This is Bertha Weston, all part of that same Weston family. I'm thinking this might be Tilly Warren just because of the haircut. This is Isla Boyden. That might be Florence Allen. Not sure about that. My other guess was Doris Chase. And up here in this picture, this is Minnie Fletcher, pretty sure with her back to us, and Luella Mudgett, and don't recognize others. And down here is Clara Butler and Violet Hobart, and I don't know who this woman is. These lawn parties were quite the thing. Sugar on Snow was served. There were all kinds of little tables selling goods. It was just a really fun time. Also, before these, there was held an Old Home Day. I don't have any pictures of that. But also during these years, there was an annual Christmas Bazaar. This was held in the Mary Reynolds Community Hall, which was torn down in 1977. And that was where Bruce McMillan's gas pumps are. But the Christmas Bazaar was people with, it was like a bazaar with little tables. People had all their goods out for sale, and it was a big potluck dinner. My last memory of one was when my oldest child, Jen, was an infant, and we went to that. She was about a month old, and Roberta Marsh walked around that hall the entire evening carrying my baby. I was thrilled. Roberta was thrilled. It was great. And it was very noisy in there because the room was just full of people, and this baby didn't care. So I talked a little bit about the annual Children's Day we had at the end of the school year. And also there were Christmas pageants by the children, and sometimes Easter pageants by the children also. Also during many, many years, we had Easter sunrise services through my growing up years and through my kids' growing up years. They would be held on some sort of a hill or a meadow or pasture or something where you could see the sunrise in the east. A few years we went up the mountain, took the chairlift up the mountain and had the service up there. And these Easter sunrise services were almost always followed by a pancake breakfast in either the Jeffersonville Church or the Cambridge Church. In 1987, the men's breakfast started on a Saturday morning once a month. The men cooked their own breakfast and then had a little, a lesson or a sharing or something. I was not privy to that. Those eventually morphed into meeting at a restaurant for breakfast once a month. And there is still we call it now a community group that meets at 158 Main, 7:30 on the first Saturday of every month. So I'm hoping when COVID gets over that we'll be able to get back to that again. There were baptisms. The first immersion baptism was held in 1979 in the Upstrups Pond, and many others in subsequent years up there. And later, baptisms were held in the Coles Pool, the last one being in 1998. There also started during this time in the 90s a ladies' night out, and this had evolved into a sweethearts dinner when the men served the women a nice dinner on Valentine's Day. This is still being served in some groups. It's quite nice to be served by our men. And on 1995, someone in the church went to a Promise Keepers conference and came back and started a Wednesday morning men's group. They meet at 5:30 in the morning before the men all had to go to work. This group continues to meet to this day. So there you have it. We have 7 churches that have been in our town. We now have 3 active churches, Cambridge, St. Mary's, and the Jeffersonville one, which has now become a new building. And I think that's all I have.